Hey everybody. So today we're going to talk about the different interpretations of the American Revolution. Now, you might be asking yourself, wait, it's just one event. How could there be different interpretations of it, right? Facts are facts. And well, yes, there are facts that certain things happened, but a lot of times it's the interpretation which drives the narrative. And we always need to be wary because when anyone ever writes anything, they want you to believe something. And so today, we're going to look at the different interpretations of the same fact of the revolution. Now, the leadership of the American Revolution themselves went to fairly great lengths not to write histories of the revolution. They commented about it from time to time in their letters and in their memoirs, but they were a little uncomfortable about writing much about the facts and events of the period. John Adams was asked on several occasions to write a history of the revolution, and he always refused. After it was over, Sam Adams made a bonfire behind his back porch and very carefully burned all of his notes and letters from the period. For a couple of decades, there was very little history written from the patriotic point of view. From the point of view of the American historians since the event, four major frameworks have emerged that can be used to explain the events from 1763 to 1789, from the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, to the creation of the U.S. Constitution. These four frameworks each make consistent sense of the events and outcomes of the revolution. The first is the Whig interpretation, and this is the view taken by the rebels themselves. The revolution was a revolt for freedom and liberty against the tyrannical regime of George III and his renegade ministry. The issue was liberty and the preservation of the rights of Englishmen against tyranny. It was a conservative revolution, fought to preserve traditional English political values, not to create any new principles, but to preserve old liberties guaranteed to British citizens, and it infringed upon by a tyrannical king, a corrupt ministry, and an unjust and overreaching parliament. For Whig historians, American colonists, although they might have had their differences, generally agreed on the principles of the revolution and fought together to achieve their liberties. This was not a social revolution based on class or group interests, but a conservative revolution to gain independence and liberty. It was only one revolution, the colonies versus Great Britain. For Whig historians, the culmination of the American Revolution was the creation and ratification of the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution represented an emphatic national act to codify and preserve the principles of the revolution. The progressive interpretation emerged over 100 years after the creation of the United States during the Progressive Era around 1900. In the early 20th century, the progressives saw conflict everywhere they looked, and they still do. Usually, the conflict had to do with class or interests, workers versus big business, urban merchants versus rural farmers, railroads versus the farmers, bankers versus debtors, corrupt rich politicians versus everybody else. This was the age of the muckraker. The progressive historians looked at the American Revolution and saw conflicts, not only between colonists and the mother country, but also between differing classes and interests in the colonies. Often, progressivists argued that these local class conflicts in the colonies were more important than the differences between the colonies and Great Britain. Some recent progressive scholars, called the neo-progressives, even largely ignore the conflicts between Britain and the colonies altogether, focusing almost exclusively on class and social conflict among the colonists. For these neo-progressives, the British were simply an irritant that complicated class relations in the colonies. The first important progressive historian was a man by the name of Carl Lotus Becker. He put the interpretation this way. The American Revolution was not only about home rule, but also about who should rule at home. For Becker and for future progressives, there were two American revolutions, one against the mother country, and the other an internal revolution between small farmers and small merchants, and mechanics and artisans against the wealthy, powerful elite. For progressives, interests motivate people, not ideas. The great ideas of liberty and freedom, progressivists argue, were made up by the elite to rationalize their actions. Charles Beard, a progressive economic historian, argued that the aims of the revolution were successful by 1783. America had achieved independence from Britain and the states under the Articles of Confederation, and they had achieved more democratic institutions that protected the political and economic rights of small farmers, small merchants, and the poorer elements of American society from the wealthy elite. For Beard, the Constitution represented a counter-revolution, a coup by the wealthy elite to retake control of the nation and reassert their power and influence. For progressives, the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation were good and represented the spirit and principles of the American Revolution. The Constitution and establishment of the national federal system was a betrayal of the principles of the Revolution. Consensus historians, unlike the progressives, look at the way the ideas affected people. Gordon Wood developed what he would call the Republican synthesis, which basically said that the ideas of the Enlightenment came and infiltrated America and influenced them to fight for their liberty and their rights. The shared values of individual freedom and democracy were far more important than the class conflicts and class struggles that the progressives argued. Wood also, however, agreed with the progressives that the making of the Constitution was a sort of counter-revolution of the elite against the small farmers and small merchants. Two other consensus historians were Richard Hofstadter and Edmund Morgan. Both have works that are still used in college graduate courses today. The neo-progressives that we talked about earlier are classified as the New Left historians. They see everything through the lens of class conflict and diversity. Many times, they'll disregard all British infringement on American liberties and rights and instead focus on the conflict between the wealthy and the unwealthy American colonists. They're also very interested in diversity. They study women's roles and minority roles in the American Revolution rather than looking at the picture as a whole. Their insistence on looking about diversity and the differences was born out of the civil rights movement and the hippie movement, which happened concurrently with the rise of the New Left. So any of these views can be used to interpret and make sense of the American Revolution, but they are generally mutually exclusive interpretations. Even today, whatever you believe is as much of a matter as where you stand politically and ideologically as any other consideration. Historians who are conservative generally take the Whig or the consensus approach to the revolution. Historians of a liberal persuasion use the progressive or the New Left interpretation. The Whig and the consensus school argue that in spite of differences in wealth and status, Americans generally have fewer differences in terms of class and interest than other societies and nations, and also that Americans generally agree upon the most core ideas and values that were basic in the Revolution. The liberal historians still view most issues in terms of class conflict and generally discount ideas and values, or at least ideas that aren't their ideas, as the rhetoric employed by the elite to manipulate and control the masses. Thus, the liberal historians generally agree with the progressive or neo-left interpretation of the revolutionary history. Now, something that you should know before we move on. A successful interpretation of history depends upon making the facts fit the interpretation. Any interpretation that doesn't consider all of the pertinent facts is a pretty lame interpretation. All of these interpretations deal with facts pretty well, and some neo-progressive interpretations are a bit more tortured than older progressive interpretations, but by and large, good historians, no matter what their ideological leanings, do a pretty good job of making the facts fit the interpretation. And next time, we'll take a look at the American Revolution itself, and then you can decide for yourself which interpretation that you agree with.